Good morning. I am with pleasure seeing that all of you came, and it is with great pleasure also that I would like to introduce Dr. Jan T. Gross from NYU. He's also the author, of course, of Neighbors, one of the most important books of our time. So, as I told last night, and I would like to beg the forgiveness for all of you who have heard already what I am saying, but I cannot emphasize it enough, that this book had a major impact. Unlike many books that we are writing in academia that don't have a direct impact, this book had a direct impact on the development and future of Polish perceptions of culture, politics, the Holocaust, and therefore the future of Poland. Before I say anything more, we would like to ask him to come, and we are telling him that we will listen with great attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for these wonderful introductions. I don't know whether you are tired of listening to these wonderful words, but I am not. So, what I would like to do today, perhaps, is just to give you a fairly brief introduction on the context in which this book has been published, the reception that it has received, and perhaps. After that, we'll just open the floor and have our conversation directed towards various aspects of this that might be of interest, of greater interest to you. So I'll follow, as it were, the path that you will suggest to me by your questions, rather than deliver a lengthy speech. Well, the story of Jedwabne is more or less familiar to you. So I would like perhaps only to say that the way in which I mean, two things have to be kept in mind when one reflects on reception of the and try to make sense of it in Poland. The first, and I emphasized it last evening, but I want to say it again, is that the experience of war in Eastern Europe, in Poland, when we're talking about Poland now, has been very dramatic, not simply for the Jewish population that has been destroyed completely, but also for everybody else. The German policies of occupation were extraordinarily brutal, and in the collective memory of the Poles, the war period stands, and rightly so, as a time of unspeakable suffering, of horrendous losses, population losses, and material losses. If you look really at the, just in one sentence, the German and then Soviet policies of occupation aimed very deliberately at the very beginning at kind of decapitation of the Polish society. In other words, elimination of elites. And everybody, really all social milieus, leaders of political parties, civil servants, intellectuals, teachers, you name it, you just think about the segment of society within which a leadership stratum emerges. These were targets of one and the other occupier, depending on where you were, and these were targets essentially for extermination. There is the life loss among the elites in particular was staggering in Poland. Again, these are very general numbers, but if you look at statistics of which have been produced immediately after the war, you'll see that somewhere in the vicinity of 20% of the Polish population, and that includes the Jews, the Polish in the sense of Polish citizens, before the war, has been has died as a result of war and war-related causes. Now, this is immense. I mean, numerically speaking, the kind of numbers which are tossed around is 6 million victims altogether, out of which 3 million are Jews. The rest are non-Jews. But as I say, kind of a selectively drawn from upper strata, in fact, of the population. So, in other words, the memory of the war is a memory of this horrendous suffering and martyrology. And to set the stage, it's very difficult in a context like this, in which one views oneself as a victim, to take in also another aspect of this experience, namely an aspect which tells you this was a period of profound demoralization, and it across the board, so to speak, and it also happened that the victim was a victimizer, that there was a kind of a hierarchy and very deliberate policy on the part of the Nazis to stratify the subjugated group, and they did so, unfortunately, successfully. And those who had been targeted for repression, nevertheless, given that there was yet another group within this society which was lower, so to speak, on the pole of the German racial madness, that various elements of the Polish society have, and in a variety of ways, been drawn into the process of victimization of Polish Jews. Incredibly difficult and psychologically, it seems to me, very complicated message to receive, especially if, and there is, I don't want to go into it, I mean, there is a whole 19th century narrative of Polish history which views Poles as victims of violence perpetrated by ganging up bigger neighbors that have partitioned Poland for more than a century, that have and that Poland stood up to it and in a variety of ways sort of asserted the righteous causes, both in the 19th century, the causes of national liberation. There were several uprisings in Poland that are viewed as a kind of a moment of national honor. During the Second World War, it's the same. The resistance to the German occupation feeds into the national myth of resistance standing up against a stronger enemy and prevailing at the cost of tremendous sacrifice. Tremendous sacrifice. Just let me give you one episodic, so to speak, information. I'm sure many of you have it. Though in America this is a historical episode which somehow gets fused with another historical episode of this period. There was an uprising in Warsaw, the Warsaw Uprising, not the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. There was also an uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943. A very dramatic and very important episode. But in 1944, there is an uprising in Warsaw. It starts in August of 1944, at the time when already the offensive from the east really comes very close. In fact, the Red Army is stationed on the Vistula, the river that cuts Warsaw in half. And during that uprising against the Germans, 250,000 people died, 250,000 civilians and those who were part of this military Polish underground, but it was a kind of a army made up of civilians. Add to this the fact that, like in all East European countries, in all countries that have sort of centralized governments, it's the capital which draws and assembles really the elite of the nation. The loss of human capital, not only just simply the loss of human lives, as it were, which the country has suffered on this occasion, is just unimaginable. One of the great literary critics after the war, commenting on the death of a very young man, his name was Krzysztof Kamil Baczyński, 23 years old, great poet by then, who was a soldier in the Home Army and who died at the very beginning of the uprising. And then this literary critic, Kazimierz Wyka, writes a beautiful essay, and then at some point there is a sentence in it: Poland must be a very, very rich country. It shoots at its enemies with bullets made of diamond. You know, the elite of the nation which goes to the barricades and perishes on these occasions in a fight. In other words, you have to keep this in mind. There is a very deeply ingrained and one that's rooted in actual experience, memory, and then mythologized memory of war as this horrendous sacrifice which Polish nation has paid, and in fact, and later on got betrayed too. This is the longest fighting state and society against the Germans. At the end of the war, of course, together with everybody else in Eastern Europe, it gets sort of sold to the Soviets, and it becomes a part of them. So it's a very dramatic period. Here comes the narrative, which in the Jedwabne story becomes very dramatically laid out, in which it turns out that there were episodes of this massive, if you will, well, let's put it in those terms, collaboration or collusion or just activities that were carried out by Polish neighbors against their Jewish fellow citizens. It's an incredibly complicated thing to take in. You know, just one sentence about the mythology that comes, and it's a very, very important and very formative topos, if you wish, in the story of national consciousness and nation building. One of the very important themes of which is drawn from the 19th century and Romantic poetry that's great in Poland. Really, it just so happens that there were a few absolute geniuses that were writing. It's very much in a kind of a nation that is constructed through words. Is the notion of assistance, giving assistance in a calamity to brother nations, just like General Bem went to Hungary during. But the notion that one fights for one's own cause by fighting for liberation of peoples somewhere else. You know, here, very, very important topos there, you know, that Poles are in a mythologized and completely kind of a mystical variation, the Christ of nations. This will be literally one of the themes that appears there, kind of have sacrificed themselves on behalf of everybody else, repeatedly. And here you have a situation in which there is the kind of the fellowship of victims, of which Poland was a symbol, that you just stand up for victims everywhere and fight on their behalf, has been, this whole theme is just totally undermined, because it's not even a question of an abstract argument. You know, we went with Napoleon and fought. We went we fought on behalf of Hungarians. We fought in all the wonderful revolutions against all kinds of oppression, against Tsarism, etc., etc. It turns out that the fellow human beings, who are not just an abstract entity somewhere else, but who are neighbors living right next door, have not been recognized as fellow victims. I mean Polish Jews. That there is not, suddenly you have to take in that what has happened during the war on repeated occasions, and Jedwabne is a very drastic and radical embodiment of this kind of behavior, but there was a whole range of attitudes that Polish neighbors have taken vis-à-vis their Jewish neighbors that were not, to put it mildly, helpful to the Jews, and did not really help them to survive the war. There was an organization that was to help the Jews. There are people who have helped the Jews at the risk of their lives, and in Poland that risk was very dramatic. The Germans were very strict in enforcing a death penalty, essentially, for assisting the Jews, to anybody who dared to do so. So there were numerous people, and I say an organization that was sponsored by the Polish underground, which is called Żegota, and deliberately a kind of a committee set up to help the Jews. But these were efforts among other efforts and attitudes. And it's simply very difficult to take in the story of these other attitudes in which neighbors have forgotten their obligation to assist, even more than that, have joined in the process of persecution that the Nazis have deployed. I want to ask, so this is one aspect here which needs to be remembered. The other, I want to say that this is not really a characteristic feature and dilemma of Polish society. If you look at the history of German occupation of Europe, you will find out that virtually anywhere, any European society where, with very few exceptions, I mean, there are two of these, and I think deservedly they have to be mentioned, Bulgaria and Denmark, local societies or local administrations, whether it was in a variety such as in France, where there was a collaborating administration, or in a variety such as in Hungary or in Romania, where these were sort of quasi-independent states that were, of course, client states, and all kinds of activities were then engaged in by both local people and local administrations, or in Holland, a very civilized country, if you wish, the kind of a middle of the heart of Western Europe, if you will. 75% of Dutch Jews have not survived the war. An astonishing number, and due essentially to the kind of a diligent and very, if you will, Germanic sense of good, of responsibility and ethos of good work that the Dutch administration had. And when the order came to identify Dutch citizens who were of Jewish extraction, they had very good files, and actually they produced the evidence, and then Dutch Jews could be rounded up and collected and brought to extermination centers. So anyway, the history, the behavior, the sort of various forms of collusion with these Nazi demands having to do with the process of extermination of Jews were a phenomenon that first of all is universal in a variety of ways in these, and very difficult in the historiographies of these countries to come to terms with. You know, it took 25 years at least, the French, or 30, mid-70s really, when the issue finally is confronted. What did Vichy do in that respect? And it also took a scholar who came from abroad, in a way, Robert Paxton, an American historian, to write a book that would just punch a hole in the wall, and then things started moving. In Holland, the same. It's only mid-70s in which people, in the public narrative, and there are many countries in which it has not been really taken up until today. So, what I want to say this so that we all understand that the difficulties that the Polish public opinion has with thinking honestly, as we would say, about the period of the war is just something that's not unique to Poland. Actually, it's quite spectacular what has happened as a result of the publication of Neighbors. When I sort of came face to face with this subject, and it took me a long time to realize what has happened, even though I had evidence that came my way by coincidence many years before I fully understood. And this is not just by virtue of personal confession that I'm making it. It has something to do with the way in which the story of this murder played itself out in Poland. Okay. I was very much aware once I understood what has happened in Jedwabne that it's going to be a very dramatic story for the Polish public to become acquainted with, and it has been my deliberate decision, if you wish, and plan to have the book published in Poland first, so that it does not come as a kind of a story and a news item with which the society will be confronted from abroad, as it were. This was not such a... let me say also one more thing, that a lot of people I befriended from the community of Jedwabne Jews, who were at the time, who are still alive, and who have confided in me, who have given me addresses, contacts. I was able to talk to a lot of people and so forth. As you can imagine, for them, these were all relatives who have been killed there, and just they were buried in oblivion and alive for 60 years. Another insult, as it were, added to the tragedy of the very episode. When I started working on this book, they became very taken by it, and in a way, one of their primary concerns, of course, was to make the story public as soon as possible. You know, get in touch with journalists, tell them there is all this evidence, one can do it. And it didn't take much, but I had to address this issue. I said, listen, this is very much a Polish case, Polish story. It has to come out in Poland, otherwise it will be viewed as a kind of just an accusation. It has to work itself. We have to give there a chance to have it debated publicly, and it has to come out in a proper form also, in a form of just fully documented narrative rather than just snippets, and it's too serious a matter. And they immediately understood and accepted it. You know, so I want to pay tribute, as it were, to Rabbi Baker and a few others, for whom it meant a year-long delay with the story coming out into the public, a story which was very dear to their hearts. This book came out in Poland in May of 2000. It was preceded, however, by a publication in February of 2000, an article which I wrote before I understood what has happened in Jedwabne. I was preoccupied for many, many years with the deposition, the testimony of Shmuel Wasserstein, the one with which I began and with which the book begins. You know, this is the testimony that is left in the Jewish Historical Institute archives, which essentially tells the story. And for years, I somehow came upon it while reading through the archives. I knew that something horrible happened in Jedwabne, but I couldn't really comprehend that what Wasserstein says actually literally has happened. In other words, that at the end of the day, after a whole period of murderous mayhem, as it were, everybody who was still alive, hundreds and hundreds of people, would be rounded up, brought to a barn, and burned to death. That seemed to me excessive. It just did not fit very well into the historiography of this period, that it may have happened. In those particular circumstances, at that time, and again, I don't want to get into a complicated discussion of what has been done during the Holocaust, and that, of course, such episodes were taking place. There is a certain specificity, we talked about it yesterday, to this, which makes it really unlike many other episodes. Anyway, there was in the autumn of 1999, I was asked to write an essay to a Festschrift for a colleague whose name is Tomasz Strzembosz, and who would later become a great polemicist, the kind of a mainstay of historical negative response to the book. But I liked him very much. He's personally just absolutely charming man of an older generation. We became friends. I can also tell you in what circumstances it. And to write an article for his Festschrift, so his students, etc., were preparing it. Indeed, it's a Festschrift like this. And at that time, I thought, okay, I need to publish this Wasserstein story. I don't fully understand what it means, but this is a deposition that this is a good occasion, especially that the area of Białystok is the area on which Strzembosz worked very much during the war period. So this was a very kind of a natural thing to do. And I wrote a kind of a commentary around that statement by Wasserstein, a commentary which did not really pursue to the end what Wasserstein says, which did not undermine what he says, but kind of was very elliptical. And I said, well, you know, nowadays the historiography of the Holocaust evolves in the direction of talking about these various categories of roles, of perpetrators, victims, and bystanders, witnesses. But these categories are, as we can see here, somewhat not very clear. I mean, Wasserstein's story tells us bystander. What does it mean to be a bystander? And then there is this full text of Wasserstein's testimony and my commentary that a lot we will have to study in the future the behavior of local population vis-à-vis Jews in the territories that have been occupied, because there is a lot of ambiguity and a lot of a lack of clarity as to what they had done and how they behaved, etc., etc. Period. It goes to print. Before it got printed, I already know the story. I already know what should be said about this, because in the meantime, I come across, I sort of come to terms with this issue and read the archives, and I know now what the full story is all about. And so I faced a kind of a quandary. Do I let it go to print like this, or do I pull it out and either just withdraw it completely or amend it or what? And I let it go. I thought that the history of not recognizing what happened in Jedwabne is part of the story itself, and that where my blindness here is just one of the blindnesses, so to speak, which are very interesting and need to be recorded. It turned out, everything somehow connected to the publication of this book, really, even though it seems bizarre on occasion and sort of unfortunate, in the end, sort of builds itself in a very sensible and as it were useful variation. So anyway, this article goes to print, and it comes out in February of 2000, a few months before the book will be published. The book will come out in May. And this is something which I learned later. A journalist, a very good journalist from a newspaper, from a center-right newspaper in Poland. There are two main daily newspapers, like New York Times and Washington Post, nationwide circulation. One is a kind of a left of center, if you wish, perceived by some of the Polish population as a kind of a maybe Jewish newspaper. Who knows? The editor of it is a man whose name I'm sure many of you would know, Adam Michnik. He was one of the leading dissidents throughout the communist period, someone who spent a long time in jail, a very prolific author of important essays on the role of intellectuals under communism and so forth. And anyway, his family came from a communist Jewish family. So it's called Gazeta Wyborcza, and then there is Rzeczpospolita, the kind of a center, maybe slightly to the right newspaper. The journalist that I'm talking about is from the center-right newspaper. His name is Kaczyński. He, just by a fluke, read this Festschrift. I don't know why, a book big like this. Read this piece and said to himself, my God, I mean, this is senseless. This is impossible. This guy puts out, speaking of me as an author of this text, puts out a testimony of somebody from 1945, and doesn't comment on it, doesn't check on it. It's there. I'm going to go to Jedwabne, says to himself Kaczyński, and find out what has happened, and essentially to check on Wasserstein's story. He goes to Jedwabne, starts talking to people, and of course, the story has been known in Jedwabne by everybody, including the generation that is born after the war, including a myriad of details that are far beyond what Wasserstein has. So he goes to Jedwabne and finds out within, 2 or 3 hours after he arrived that essentially this story checks. He spends then some time researching it, reads various things that have been published, goes there again. And in May of 2000, in other words, in the same month, my book will be published. I remember the date, just by coincidence. It comes out on May 19th. It's a day when there is an international book fair in Warsaw, a big international book fair. So I was literally, the first copies were brought, and I was signing them on that May 19th. His article, his first article on Jedwabne appears on May 5th, and the second on May 19th. In Rzeczpospolita, in other words, in a kind of a center-right newspaper. And in this article, Kaczyński says, well, this is a story of what has happened in Jedwabne. Already, of course, there are rumors, it's known that the book will be coming out. I had a few meetings here and there. I spoke to some audiences and immediately picked up. But what's very important here is that in the mainstream, in fact, center-right article, there appears simultaneously with the publication of the book a journalistic account, contemporaneous, someone who just went there, talked to people there, which essentially just confirms this story. I say essentially because there is simultaneously another variant of what has happened in Jedwabne, which is produced on the basis of a few articles that appeared in 1980s, and they were written by a prosecutor of a local prosecutor from Białystok area, whose name is Monkiewicz, and who had given speeches on this and written articles. He, again, I don't want to bore you with details, but in any way, in his articles published in 1980s, sometimes there is a story of how a battalion of Germans, number 209, under the command of a certain fellow by the name of Birkner, you know, there were 232 of these Germans, came to Jedwabne on that day and killed and then burned in the barn 1,600 Jews. There is indeed a stone monument in Jedwabne which says, and the inscription on it reads that 1,600 Jews have been burned in the barn here by German by Hitlerites on 10th of July of 1941. So Kaczyński, in a way, puts down in one column, you know, this is what was this prosecutor Monkiewicz has said in his articles in the 1980s. This is a story that we read in the deposition of Wasserstein that has just been published. I went to Jedwabne, I talked to people. Well, it seems that what Wasserstein has said checks. The book comes out in May, on May 19th, and for a long period of time there is silence. A few reviews here and there. This main newspaper, the Gazeta Wyborcza, does not really latch on it. The editor of it will later, I don't know whether you have seen his writing. He published an article last, I think it was in June of this year, in the New York Times on this. At the very beginning, he was so taken aback by this story. He didn't really believe it. He thought I was deceived, as it were, by this deposition. I may add that we are very good friends. We've been friends in school, in high school, and kind of. My suspicion is that he did not read the book. I told him about the story a long time ago on the basis of sort of Wasserstein's deposition, even before I knew the full extent of it, and somehow it stuck in his mind as the narrative of somebody who could have been deranged, perhaps just one narrative. And anyway, he plays. He is absolutely honest and wonderful, and the newspaper plays an incredibly important role, and will once in this affair as well, in debunking all kinds of xenophobic and prejudicial attitudes in Poland and Polish politics. But he's very careful. He doesn't want to kind of venture recklessly into the issue of anti-Semitism. There is enough of it that's very well documented in order not to, for a prudent editor, not to go after issues that, in his judgment, were not very well documented and would not be a good cause. Anyway, so for several months, this main newspaper is silent, and actually everybody just does not speak very much about it. Well, it doesn't surprise me very much. It's a terribly hard book to take in, if you just, and it takes time for it to kind of sink through. The right-wing newspapers, yes, there is immediate echo in right-wing / Catholic press. Partly an echo to the book, an echo to Kaczynski's article, of course, completely dismissive, and the argument which will later appear also in that right-wing Catholics / anti-Semitic press. And I'm just adding all of these things because there is a wonderful Catholic milieu, an incredibly important Catholic periodical, which I'll mention in a moment, really that's been for 40 years in circulation and a great source of pride, I think, to the entire Polish intelligentsia, independent of what denomination you are, which is just completely on the ball on this issue, for instance. So there is an echo on the right, an echo which brings in a theme, the following theme. This is not accidental. Of course, it's slanderous. It's not accidental that it gets published now. This is all a preparation for Jews to make claims against Poland for restitutions, just as there are all these restitution legal actions, that are going on. The next one will be against Poland, and this is what it is. This is a conspiracy. You will find this theme, in fact, several bishops, including, I may say, the primate of Poland, until very recently have hinted that this is really what's behind it. That this was really a kind of that it's a book that was written, as they say, na zamówienie. It was ordered. It's just. The story comes into huge, really a floodgate opens at the end of November, beginning of December of last year. At the end of November, there are two large pieces published in Gazeta Wyborcza. One is an long interview with a very well-known historian about this book. His name is Tomasz Szarota. And the other is a kind of a reflection piece of this journalist who made the interview with him. They appear in the same issue, who is a very well-known journalist, very talented. Not only does he write, but he had a very important television program, so someone whom millions and millions of people know very well. I happen, since my friend Adam Michnik, at the time when this thing goes to print, was in New York. He was teaching. He comes periodically for a few weeks to New School and teaches. So he was there while this thing was being prepared, and he tells me, listen, I just got a fax of this material. It will go in a few days into print. This is what's going to be published in the newspaper. So I have a kind of an advanced notice of it. And since the historian with whom this interview was conducted was a friend of mine as well, it's an interview that it's very interesting. It says, incredible story, incredible in the sense, absolutely, not that it how should I say it? It's a powerful story. I know so much about the war, but it touches me incredibly deeply. Nobody questions the basic framework of what's been said here, and the but has to do with maybe there were Germans there, which I have not really put out properly, that there is this whole story that Monkiewicz, this prosecutor, that a story that appeared in the newspaper of the German commando coming in, and this guy sort of harps on this, etc., etc. So it's, you know, there is a kind of an ambiguity in that interview. There is a similar ambiguity in this thought piece by the journalist. Ambiguity which has to do, again, which says, you know, it's just a profound book. It's like atomic bomb. It has completely shattered me. All friends of mine who have read it, they couldn't sleep, and we talked about it, etc. But, you know, isn't there too much of a generalization of this kind? You know, it's just very difficult to take in, and you just see all kinds of themes that appear here. But what's important here is this issue of the unresearched German presence that presumably was there but has not been documented. He puts it with a question mark, but nevertheless raises this issue. This will be later on, alongside with this theme which I mentioned to you of the book being a preparation and in a deliberate offensive on the part of the Jews to eventually make claims for material restitution. So this is a book that sets the stage. The second theme, as far as critical reception of it is concerned, that will run through. You see, I thought that I'll be speaking very briefly, but I don't think I'm speaking very briefly. Anyway, so the second theme there is this question of Germans. That there were more Germans, only I didn't find them. Was there a exhaustive enough research conducted? It hasn't been the assumption, the suggestion being, and that there were Germans, in fact, and that their role was much more significant. That I pointed this out. A third theme will emerge later on, and the historian, whose Festschrift I have embellished, as it were, by a half-cooked piece on Jedwabne, this Wasserstein's testimony, whose name is Strzembosz, will be the main protagonist, the main advocate, so to speak, of this theme. It's a slightly tricky theme because you cannot put it in completely, but you can put it in. I mean, let me tell you what it is. It's just this. Essentially, 1939, 1941, Jews have collaborated with the Soviets. And what happens in the summer of 1941, therefore, has to be viewed in that context. That this is a revenge for collaboration of Jews with the Soviets on the part of the Poles who have suffered as a result of it. Well, you know, in a sense, nobody can put it up as an argument that, that's why it happened, so therefore it was justified. People are not that callous or dumb. But you can shift the discussion. You can you can attempt to shift the discussion and say, well, you know, Gross did not really explore this issue, and in fact the real issue is not that the Jews had been killed, but that the Jews had collaborated with the Soviets, and generally speaking, Jews are collaborating with the Soviets. They are proto-communists, and here we go in this direction. That will appear later in Strzembosz's writing. These will be three kind of a pronged themes here. Anyway, after these articles were written, they appear in last issue, I think, in November of the Gazeta Wyborcza. It so happened that I had scheduled ahead of time. We had a friend of mine at Polish Academy of Science organized a big meeting, a kind of an open meeting, in his institute in Warsaw. He has an Institute of History of Polish Intelligentsia that would be devoted to the discussion of the Jedwabne issue. So. And the same historian who wrote the piece in Gazeta would be a kind of a discussant. So there is a kind of a quick sequence of events. You know, this issue appears in Gazeta, everybody reads it. Then the next week, I am in Warsaw, and there is a big meeting of historians in the Academy of Science in Warsaw, in which this issue is discussed once again. And in the meantime, I have written a kind of a rebuttal of what has been written by this in the interview in Gazeta, which will appear then in the next week. So 3 weeks of kind of intense exposure, and that really completely opens the floodgates. You know, since then, I mean, literally, there is no day. Now it's subsided after July 10th, which was an anniversary date on July 10th of last year. 60th anniversary of Jedwabne murder, and there was a big celebration in Jedwabne. The president of Poland came, a new monument was unveiled, etc., etc. So after July 10th, it somehow, the thing died down a little bit, the debate and intensity of it, but it's still there. But between, I would say, the beginning of January, and I happened to be in Poland during that time, I had a Fulbright to do something else, and of course didn't do my project, but was completely wrapped in the debate that ensued. Literally, there will be no every day in newspapers, weeklies, or monthlies, for instance. There will be just pages and pages, articles and articles devoted to the discussion of this. And on television, there were interviews, this kind of a firing line equivalents, or Charlie Rose equivalents in Polish television, constantly. In the radio, very important. What can I say, and now I really finish, as far as the response to this book was concerned? A kind of I mentioned to you the kind of a critical themes that have emerged, but I want to say the following. Two main newspapers in Poland, Gazeta Wyborcza and Rzeczpospolita. Rzeczpospolita, where Kaczyński's pieces were published. Rzeczpospolita publishes a whole variety of articles. Their attitude is, we're not going to be, we don't have a editorial policy as to what goes in. They eliminate complete crackpots, but there were a lot of kind of very critical. Strzembosz, the one who has argued essentially for shifting the discussion to the period of Soviet occupation, has been published there several times. But my responses to him as well, and several others. So they publish more or less things that get submitted, which are of, for the most part, of good quality. I say most part because there are some really junky things published. But the Gazeta Wyborcza, Rzeczpospolita, the Time and Newsweek of Poland, one of which is called Wprost, the other is called Polityka. Very popular weeklies, very well done. Wprost has done several pieces, and with including their editorial writing, etc., on Jedwabne, that were all dealing with it with complete honesty, accepting and drawing on and taking as a point of departure the need to recognize that this has happened, draw conclusions from it, completely open up discussion of the whole period. Polish television, public television, has financed a documentary and shown it on public television, a documentary that was exclusively done about Jedwabne by this documentarist Agnieszka Arnold, that includes absolutely shattering interviews with local people, and not exclusively Jews who have been almost victims of this. It has some fascinating footage. For example, Wasserstein, who has given this deposition, he later on emigrated. I actually had a chance still to speak with him over the phone. He died before I could reach him. He was living in Costa Rica. And I was setting up to go there, but not that I expected very much. This is what his statement at the time, of course, is much more interesting for a historian than what he would have to say 60 years later. But I wanted to meet him. He died, unfortunately, before I was able to get a cheap flight to Costa Rica. Wasserstein visited Poland several times after he left. In the 60s and 70s, he became a very successful businessman. And there were home video that he had done, visits with his children. He went there, he showed them everything. So in the film includes, for instance, these home videos by Wasserstein and many, many, many interviews with local people who just describe what has happened both in Jedwabne, in Radziłów, in Wąsosz, in these three villages. What I want to say, the president of Poland has taken an absolutely open-minded position on this from day one. I think the first time he spoke about it, he gave an interview to an Israeli newspaper. There is this Idiota Chronot, I think the really largest circulation newspaper. And from then on, several times he spoke about it. Poles have done it. There is a responsibility, even though there was no Polish state at the time, of course, but still I, as a representative, will speak about it, will ask for apology, and he went there on July 10th. It's just incredible. So the main Polish intellectuals, there is a wonderful milieu, I told you, of Polish Catholics which is from which the Pope comes. It's in Krakow, and there is a weekly that is published by this milieu. It's called Tygodnik Powszechny, a general weekly, on the highest level intellectual weekly you can imagine, and one of just impeccable honesty and courage always. Just to give you a sense, in 1953, this was the only newspaper or periodical, probably in all of Eastern Europe and Soviet bloc, that refused to print an obituary for Stalin. It was something that required quite a lot of courage. It was closed then, and these people, this was taken away from them for a while. It was returned to them in '56, but you know, they didn't know what will happen. They could have all been just shot on the next day. And this group remained, and the great editor of this newspaper died, of this periodical, of this weekly died 2 or 3 years ago, Jerzy Turowicz, but it's still. Anyway, they are just completely on the ball in this issue. President, public television, main newspapers, main weeklies, the most important monthlies. There are these kind of, if you wish, I don't know how to, what analogy one could draw here. I mean, we don't read months, but New York Review of Books, maybe, if it were a monthly. They are incidentally also Catholic, both of them, the main two, Więź and Znak. Completely on the ball. Having said that, there is also a kind of a whole spectrum of deniers, which is situated on the right and within the Catholic Church hierarchy. You know, the Bishop of Łomża, for example, whose name is Stefanek, is just giving speeches that are absolutely horrendous. The local priest in Jedwabne, an openly self-avowed anti-Semite. Very unfortunate, because he's the man to whom everybody comes. You know, every foreign newspaper reporter would go, of course, among other places, to him. He's the guy who runs the town. The Primate of Poland is just giving these rambling texts from time to time. Whenever they don't speak, the hierarchs, with a few exceptions, there are 2 or 3 bishops who have spoken with very wise words, but there are hundreds of bishops in Poland. The Catholic hierarchy, in other words, is unfortunately just very much on the defensive. There is anyway. So I've been talking too long, and I want you to have a chance to ask some questions. But this is the layout of the land, so to speak.
Did a statement come out of the Vatican?
No, there was no statement from the Vatican, but a very important collective prayer of Polish bishops took place, a kind of a mournful prayer, a mass on 27th, I believe, of May of this year. This was one day before none of the Catholic hierarchs or Catholic priests from the area went on July 10th to Jedwabne. It was boycotted by them. But in part, what was said, that on this occasion, Polish bishops have prayed and sort of asked forgiveness for what has happened in Jedwabne, on the occasion of the meeting of Polish episcopate in Warsaw in May. And I know it from reliable sources that the Pope has pushed them to do this, and they obeyed. And they spoke with very beautiful words, but these were papal words. You know, they were quoting Pope's statements on Catholic-Jewish relationships that he had made on a few occasions. They were quoting the gospel, as long as they don't speak with their own voice, but with the voice either of the Pope or the sacred text, so to speak. It's one. But there you had, you know, there was. I think that 1/3 of Polish bishops participated in it, even though all of them were already in town, and all of them, as somebody pointed out, you know, you never had that many Polish bishops kneeling and at the same time and then praying on behalf of Jews. So something has happened, and I think to a large extent this is Pope's doing.
Very interesting statistics about word recognition of Jedwabne. I think it was 92%.
Yes.
do you have any figures for reactions to the presidential apology?
Yeah, not in my head. You know, there is a
Order.
yes, but it's there because this was a very important issue, of course. I think more or less half and half. I think that slightly more than half of the people in Poland were favorable to what the president had done, and that was the apology on behalf of the Polish nation. He has done this early on, as I say, already in March, and in some interviews that he had done after that. And the reaction, among other things, he was sued by someone, this guy has been elected to the parliament now, but for essentially defamation. The president speaks in my name, and I have not authorized him to say this, and actually I don't feel it, so you know, I feel defamed. But when he spoke in Jedwabne, he used the phrase, he said, I apologize for what has done in my name and in the name of those who feel that an apology is due. So he took into consideration that there was a kind of a ambivalent attitude towards it. But I think more or less half and half. There have been 2 public opinion polls carried out in Poland about Jedwabne, the degree of awareness, and various questions were asked, among other things. Do you think that Poles nowadays should apologize for Jedwabne, for instance? And by the Polish public opinion research, the main public opinion research center. One was done in April, the other in September of this year, and they are quite comprehensive. You can find them online, I think, if you're interested.
Yes, that was it.
What was the reaction at the time of that trial in 1949? Was there enough awareness of what happened, or did it take?
Of the trial? In 1949.
At the time, was there any kind of media coverage or even awareness that happened?
Yeah, I was very interested in this. I looked through all the newspapers of this period. I mean, in central newspapers there was nothing. There is no Łomża newspaper, but there is a Białystok newspaper, and in Białystok newspaper there was no mention of the trial.
Yes.
You mentioned in your book that before the burning, the Jews were gathered in the town square and made to go through sort of humiliations, burning of the beards. Had that happened? That seems very, had that happened in the other pogroms around? Is that?
You know, this was a very typical thing that Germans did the moment they entered towns. You know, they would proceed to humiliate Jews in a variety of ways like this. In Jedwabne there was over these 2.5 weeks before the catastrophe. There were several episodes in which the Jews were humiliated. They would be brought into the main square, for instance, in order to weed it, you know, to pick grass, a weed at a time, or to clean outhouses, you know. So there were all kinds of episodes like this. I don't think it was a sustained and very kind of very elaborate process of humiliation. In Radziłów, in this neighboring town, Germans were there longer, and they were engaged for several days in all kinds of activities of that sort. So the spectacle mainly would take place there. But these are towns that are just right next to one another, you know, and everybody knows everything, but because people are, first of all, related, they go from place to place, you know, and
Yes.
You alluded to a documentary earlier. Is there a documentary being made about this with interviews?
it has been made. You can. It's called Sąsiedzi, Neighbors. The director is. This is the name of the director, and actually it has very good English subtitles as well. I know a few people in America who have a copy of it. I'm sure it will come here sooner or later, sooner rather than later. But it's been shown on Polish television. Yeah. There are 2 one-hour parts of it. Very, very powerful film.
I have another question.
Yeah.
In the book, Hitler's Willing Executioners talks about how the Germans recruited a lot of the local people to carry out a lot of the atrocities that were done. They weren't just Germans. So what you're saying here is that the Germans, I have not yet read the book, but that the Germans really did not promote this at all. It was all promoted from within.
No, I'm not saying that. the Germans in the initial stage, and the process, so to speak, of German recruitment of local people into carrying out these pogroms. This is a very complex. There is a whole variety of ways in which it can be done, you know. And of course, Germans, the Einsatzgruppen that came into, or that were fighting on the Eastern Front, this was part of their policy. They had it. They were ordered even to do this and just encourage, instigate. As far as Jedwabne goes, there was definitely a consultation between a group of Germans. They came from outside into Jedwabne, a small group. We don't know exactly how many, but they came in a passenger car rather than, you know, in a truck. It may have been 8 people, maybe 4, we don't know. And some sort of agreement that whether they said, well, please do this, or whether it's been addressed to them because already these pogroms have taken place. The request was addressed to them from the local municipal authorities, we don't know. But that was the extent of their involvement. You know, they sort of, it was a hands-off story. The only thing that they did, and we may yet find the product of it, they took pictures of it. In my judgment, this was a film. It's not just a matter of photographs. They were filming it, it seems to me, and that was it. There was no other involvement, as it were. As far as use of local people by the Germans in order to do these things, there were a myriad of ways. You know, later on there will be a kind of auxiliary units, the people who would actually have some sort of uniforms drawn, recruited from the local population. That was one of the ways. There would be instances in which there was German kind of a military presence and some sort of involvement, and various elements of the locals would be brought in and encouraged to do this. So Jedwabne is unusual because of this, first of all, no hands-on the part of the Germans during the pogrom, and at the very beginning it's a kind of a very loose and nebulous collaborative relationship between them. Just seemed right, you know. I think it's divided into preparations and murder or something like this. Yeah.
Thank you very much.